Family and fellow soldiers, I'm the Professor, and this is the Moment of Truth. This morning's briefing concerns a question of equal justice and the authorities in Florida just trying to get even. Elijah Mackey, a black employee, was working at a Checkers restaurant when on May 21st, just after 10 o'clock p.m., a customer had become irate in the drive-thru. The customer, who in this case was a white male, became furious and began to argue with the female employee. The problem? He was angry because they hadn't put more mayonnaise packets in his order. That's not a joke. That's what actually happened. I guess some folks really like their mayonnaise. Mackey had walked to the front of the restaurant to speak to this angry customer, and witnesses say that's when the man began to verbally assault Elijah, making derogatory remarks about him. Now, that word derogatory, that's the word that the authorities used. Derogatory. Sounds like somebody was trying to do a clumsy euphemism for racial. Well, at some point afterwards, Mackey felt threatened enough to pull a small handgun from his waistband that he carried for personal defense, and he allegedly fired on Robertson, who later died at the hospital. When police found Mackey, he readily told them that he had a firearm on his person and he didn't give them any trouble, so he wasn't some bullet-firing desperado, despite what the white right tries to claim. This young man has since been charged with first-degree murder, and he is now being held without bail. Idiots like Rupert Murdoch's New York Post are trying to sensationalize this by flat-out editorializing the story and characterizing Mr. Mackey as, quote, unhinged. Well, I haven't found any mention of him having any priors, nor is there any mention of him having any sort of mental issues either, and the New York Post clearly didn't find anything, or they surely would have published it. So where's this unhinged stuff coming from? That's the white media for you. Under any other circumstances, they would be telling you that we have to wait for all the facts to come out, like they did when they defended Daniel Penny, or they would otherwise be saying we can't rush to judgment. We need to let the investigation unfold on its own and just let it be. Well, that's not what they're doing here. This entire fiasco happened because a customer became furious at not getting enough mayonnaise packets with his order. He became so angry that he chose to get out of his vehicle, go into the restaurant, and began to argue with the female employee. Then when Mr. Mackey tried to reason with him, he began to make potentially racially derogatory remarks at him. But the New York Post doesn't characterize Robertson as unhinged, nor do they try to dirty him up by seeing if he has any priors or previous scrapes with the law. As a first offense charge, Mr. Mackey should have been given some sort of bail, and had he not been black, that's what would have happened. We've seen enough instances like this occur, especially in Ron DeSantis' Florida, to know how these things go, and this is not at all being handled like any of those other cases. There's something else that needs to be mentioned here. Fast food workers are scared for their safety, and rightly so. See, this kind of thing happens pretty frequently in Ron DeSantis' Florida. I told you about the case of Corey Pujols, an employee at a Dunkin Donuts in Tampa. A white customer in the drive-thru got upset over an alleged lack of customer service and got out of his vehicle, stormed into the store, and began hurling racial slurs at Mr. Pujols. After repeatedly telling this thug to leave the store several times, the situation eventually turned physical, and Pujols uppercut the out-of-control man, who later died. In the case of Vonell Cook, prosecutors in Florida tried to bring charges against Pujols for defending himself. He had broken no laws, but in the end, they were forced to have to go for a plea deal, when in reality, the charges shouldn't have been brought in the first place. And why did the prosecutors drop their flimsy case? Because, as one prosecutor put it, the so-called victim had what prosecutors called a very troublesome criminal history, and that he was a, quote, unsympathetic victim. Now, that phrase, troublesome criminal history, was doing a lot of heavy lifting. And notice that the prosecutors never actually mentioned what Vonell Cook's crime was. The white media downplayed it completely, saying that he was merely a registered sex offender, which could practically mean anything. Well, when you do some searching, you find out he raped a child, as well as sexually abusing a number of other children. That's what he did. This guy was a serial child rapist. That's what his sex offense was. And you had all these white supremacists who were furious, not at the child rapist who was assailing these fast food workers, but at Corey Pujols for defending himself. And they were really furious that it was Vonell Cook's use of a racial slur that prompted the uppercut heard round the Florida panhandle. They were outraged, and many of them expressed terror at the idea that this pedophile's use of a racial slur resulted in his death, and that the DA declined to prosecute Corey Pujols. That was what they were really outraged about. You go back sometime and read those comment sections around this story, and you see these wannabe race soldiers were shook at what happened in this case. All they could talk about was, somebody shouldn't die just because they call you a nigger. White supremacists can't handle taking an L, so don't think that those Florida yokels forgot about this case. It was only 4 years ago. The similarities between what happened to Corey Pujols and the case of Elijah Mackey are eerily similar, especially how the authorities have chosen to handle it. One thing that doesn't get talked about either by these fast food companies or really any of these companies that are in the service industry is what happens when their employees are violently attacked by people. When you have people getting in their faces, that's usually a precursor to some sort of physical assault. And these violent encounters happen a lot more often than you hear from the white media. A number of fast food workers have been grievously injured or even killed by angry customers who never attack them for a good reason. They just do it because they feel entitled. And people like Vonell Cook who think they have a right to look down on these people simply because of where they work. This is the reality of what it means for people who work in the fast food industry and the sheer volume of people that they deal with. Violent encounters are a lot more common than people know. When you have somebody who chooses to get out of their vehicle, storms into the restaurant, and begins an angry confrontation with staff, the people who work there don't know if this guy is armed or not, if he's on drugs or not, or in the case of Vonell Cook, if he's a child rapist or not. And in a state like Florida, where a disproportionate number of people own guns, and police and prosecutors have made no secret of how if a black person is killed by a non-black person, they'll just let the assailant go, and most likely won't even bring charges, we need to see this from Elijah Mackey's point of view, because he's not being treated the way he would be were the roles reversed. And that's not justice. Sure, we've all had rotten experiences when it comes to the fast food industry, but to have a fight over mayonnaise? Is it that serious? And keep in mind, were the racial roles reversed, wouldn't we be hearing people claiming that a black person getting angry at not getting enough hot sauce with their wings is some form of black fatigue? Isn't it always some black person who's getting in people's faces, etc., etc.? Isn't that what we would be hearing under any other circumstances? Now you have these white supremacists who get furious when people make a connection between certain demographics and a love affair with mayonnaise. It's a sore point for some people. For example, Tamara Mowry said her white husband checked her when she made him a sandwich and merely asked if he wanted extra mayo on it. He excoriated her, telling her that it's a racist thing to assume that he likes mayonnaise just because he's white. Now, this wasn't some on-again, off-again thing with these two. She was making this fool a sandwich and asking him about mayonnaise, and apparently that set him off. This guy's got nerve casting aspersions on people for assuming things about race because this guy, Adam Housley, he used to work at Fox News. He worked at the cable news clavern, and he's pretending to be outraged because his high yellow wife asked him about mayonnaise. I'll bet he was waiting years to be able to drag out that phony outrage card. Tamara Mowry's husband felt angry because he allegedly felt that his wife was stereotyping him based on loving mayonnaise. Well, in the case in Florida, it turned out to be accurate. But I think this tragic confluence of events has far less to do with Elijah Mackey and Wesley Robertson than it does with the authorities down there in Florida, at the legislative and administrative levels. You can't have two sets of rules. You cannot have stand your ground when the person killed is black, but it's first-degree murder when the person accused of killing someone is black. This is color-coded injustice, and the reason it's not consistent is because it's not meant to be. It's meant to be hypocritical. It's deliberately designed, and the people who run it intentionally carry it out with an eye towards prosecuting black defendants and not prosecuting anyone else. It's not about justice. They could care less about that. It's about maintaining a racial order through state apparatuses. And everyone knows it, which is why people behave the way they do. Were this not the racial double standard, if the laws were applied equally to everyone regardless of color, then the rules of the road would be clear, and there would be less people flipping out and less people feeling like they're in a life-and-death situation. The real problem isn't a lack of customer service. It's a lack of equal justice. That's the underlying issue that fuels these events. They're the ones to blame for these incidents. Until these police and prosecutors stop being blatantly racist in how they carry out their duties, then the hazards of fast food will be more than just someone spitting in your food. Good day, and be one. I'd like to take a moment to mention some of our contributors. BC, Hildman Gallo, Frank Den, Ikekas Dorset, and Deep Eye 904. Salute to them and thank you to everyone for listening, liking, and sharing this message. Black empowerment only exists because of you.